When Dr. Laura meets her husband Richard to discuss their divorce, she expects a cold, civil conversation. Instead, she finds a will on the table, unraveling a web of deception darker than she imagined. Secrets, betrayals, and shocking twists drive her toward an unexpected final decision that changes everything. Laura stepped into the cafe, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pastries doing little to soothe the knot in her stomach. The midday crowd buzzed softly around her, their conversations a low hum of everyday life, of mundane things, none of which mirrored the turmoil that had taken root in her own life. She had come here to have a straightforward conversation. One that was long overdue. The divorce, while painful, was inevitable, and Laura had steeled herself for the cold practicality of it. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on Richard seated at a corner table, his back straight, his fingers tapping impatiently against the wood. He looked out of place in this warm, casual setting. His crisp suit, tailored to perfection, seemed to belong in a boardroom, not in a quaint cafe where people came to relax. But that was Richard, always calculating, always polished, always in control. Or at least, that's what he liked to project. Laura made her way over, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her heartbeat sinking with each step. She wasn't nervous, not exactly. After years of their marriage unraveling in slow motion, this was the inevitable next step. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head 100 times. Keep it brief. Keep it civil. No need to drag out what was already broken beyond repair. But as she reached the table and took a seat across from him, something felt off. Richard barely glanced at her before returning his gaze to something on the table in front of him. She followed his eyes, expecting to see the menu. Instead, her breath caught slightly. A stack of papers. Legal papers. Not divorce papers. A will. Her eyes flicked back up to Richard, searching his face for an explanation. He didn't offer one. He just leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "I ordered you a coffee," he said, his voice smooth, as though they were about to discuss the weather. "I wasn't sure if you'd still take it black." Laura blinked, her fingers twitching in her lap. Black, like everything else in her life lately. She ignored the pang of nostalgia, the way his words triggered memories of early mornings together when things were good, when things were easy. That was long gone. "What's this?" she asked, nodding toward the papers. Richard didn't look down. "That," he said, with a trace of something almost casual, "is my will." The words hung in the air between them, thick and strange, out of place in a conversation that was supposed to be about separating their lives, not planning the end of his. Laura frowned, feeling the tightness in her chest shift from unease to something darker, something heavier. "I thought we were here to talk about the divorce," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "We are," Richard replied, his gaze steady now, meeting hers directly for the first time since she sat down. "But there are other things you need to know." Laura felt her fingers curling into fists under the table. She hadn't come here for this. This wasn't supposed to be another one of his games. But there it was again, that familiar feeling of being blindsided, like every important moment in their marriage had been on his terms, his timing, his script. She glanced at the will, her mind racing. "Why are you showing me this now?" Richard sighed, the kind of heavy, calculated sigh that seemed designed to evoke sympathy, but only deepened her wariness. "Because I've been diagnosed," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I don't have much time." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the noise of the cafe dimming around her. For a moment, Laura couldn't speak. Her breath hitched, and she forced herself to focus on the sound of it, trying to keep her composure. "You're sick?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. Her medical mind immediately kicked into gear, racing through the possibilities. He didn't look sick, didn't act like a man facing his mortality. But then again, Richard had always been a master of disguise. He nodded, his expression unchanging. Terminal. The word landed between them like a stone, cold and immovable. Laura stared at him, searching for something: remorse, fear, vulnerability. Anything to suggest this was real, that this was the same man she had once loved, who had once held her hand and promised her a life together. But Richard's face remained impassive, his eyes calculating as always. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked, her voice harder now, the anger bubbling up, though she wasn't entirely sure who it was directed at. Him, for keeping this from her, or herself, for feeling anything at all. "I'm telling you now," he said, his tone clipped, almost annoyed that she hadn't caught on sooner. "That's why I wanted to meet today. There's no point in dragging out the divorce when it doesn't matter anymore." Laura blinked, her confusion deepening. "Doesn't matter? What do you mean it doesn't matter?" Richard leaned forward, folding his hands on the table, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm dying, Laura. Do you really think it's worth fighting over who gets what? I've already made arrangements. You don't have to worry about anything." Arrangements. The word sent a shiver down her spine. Laura glanced at the will again, unease turning to suspicion. Something was off. She could feel it in her bones. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked, her voice low. She could feel the shift in the conversation now, the invisible line she had just crossed. This wasn't just about his illness. It was about control. The same control he had exercised throughout their marriage, the same control he was trying to exert even now, at the end. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll see," he said softly, his tone almost patronizing. "It's all in there." Laura's heart pounded in her chest. The civil conversation she had planned was slipping further and further away, replaced by something darker, something far more unsettling. She had come here to end things, to close a chapter of her life that had long since turned sour. But now, staring at the will and the man across from her, she realized this was far from over. Laura stared at the will, her fingers hovering just above it, as if touching the paper might make the whole situation more real, more tangible. Richard sat back in his chair, his expression so calm, so detached that it made her skin prickle. How could he be so nonchalant about his own death? The man who had always controlled every detail of his life, who had insisted on order and precision in everything, was now casually announcing that he was dying, and worse, acting as if it didn't even matter. "Terminal," she repeated, her voice low, almost disbelieving. The word tasted strange on her tongue. This was not how she had expected their marriage to end, not with secrets and documents and cold announcements over coffee. She had imagined a quiet, painful divorce, the final breaking point of years of emotional distance. But this? This was something else. "Yes," Richard replied, his tone almost bored. He took a sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate care. "I've known for a few months now." A few months? Laura's mind raced. They had been living under the same roof, sharing the same spaces, even going through the motions of a life together, and he had said nothing. Not a word. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't help it. Her emotions were rising, bubbling to the surface. She had been prepared for this to be difficult, but not like this. "Why keep this from me?" Richard gave a small shrug. "What difference would it have made? You were already leaving." It felt like a slap. She had been ready to move on, yes. She had accepted that their marriage had failed, but this, his illness, should have changed everything. Shouldn't it? Her mind was swimming, trying to make sense of it all. How could he have let her plan a divorce while knowing he had so little time left? Laura stared at him, feeling something cold settle in her chest. You should have told me. I had a right to know. And then what? Richard asked, his voice smooth, like they were discussing a business transaction. Would you have stayed? Out of pity? Would that have made everything better? The word stung. Pity? No, it wasn't about pity. It was about trust, about the years they had spent building a life together. But that trust had eroded slowly over time, hadn't it? Piece by piece, until there was nothing left but formality and distance. She wasn't sure she could have done anything differently, but she still felt cheated. Betrayed, even. What are you leaving me? She asked quietly, shifting the conversation to the will in front of her. She couldn't bring herself to look at him now, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers. It was easier to focus on the legalities, the practicalities, than on the emotions swirling inside her. Richard raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. Nothing. Laura blinked, not sure she had heard him correctly. Excuse me? I'm leaving you nothing, Richard said, his tone still maddeningly calm. You won't need it, Laura. You're a successful doctor. You'll be fine on your own. His words were a blow she hadn't expected. She felt her stomach drop, her mind struggling to catch up. After everything they had been through, after all the years of building a life together, he was leaving her nothing? Her voice came out cold, a sharp edge to it she rarely used. You're leaving me nothing, Richard? After all these years? Richard's eyes flickered, just for a moment, something darker passing through his gaze before he looked away. You don't need my money. You've made that clear. You're independent now, right? You don't want to be tied down to anything. The accusation was there, subtle but unmistakable. Laura clenched her jaw, the frustration rising in her throat. This wasn't about money. It was about how he had reduced their entire relationship, everything they had shared, down to a single act of control. Even now, with his death supposedly looming, Richard was manipulating the situation, dictating the terms. You don't get to make this decision for me, Laura said, her voice steadier now, her anger giving her clarity. This is about more than money. I don't know what you want me to say, Richard replied, his tone laced with indifference. I've made peace with it. You should, too. Made peace with it. She had heard him say that twice now, and each time, it grated on her. How could he be so detached? This wasn't just his life, it was theirs. Or at least, it had been. Laura took a deep breath, her mind whirling with the pieces of this puzzle that didn't quite fit. Something was off. Something didn't add up. When were you planning to tell me? She asked, her voice quieter now, probing. Were you just going to let me walk away without knowing? Richard looked at her, his expression unreadable. I didn't see the point in burdening you with it. Burden. The word hit her harder than it should have. It implied she was somehow better off not knowing, that her decision to leave had absolved her of any responsibility toward him. But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Laura leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. What are you hiding, Richard? For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his eyes. A crack in the cool facade. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same impenetrable mask. "I'm not hiding anything," he said, but the words felt hollow. Laura didn't believe him. Not for a second. Something about this situation, the timing of it, the will, his casual dismissal of everything they had built, felt wrong. It was too neat, too controlled. And Richard was never one to let go of control. She sat back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, the tension in her shoulders building. "You've always been a master at keeping secrets," she said, her voice tight. "But this? You're not telling me everything." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking down to the papers before meeting hers again. For a moment, she thought he might crack, that he might finally drop the pretense and tell her what was really going on. But instead, he gave her a small, calculated smile. "I don't need to tell you everything, Laura. You made your choice when you asked for the divorce." It was a dismissal, and they both knew it. Laura felt a wave of frustration and anger wash over her, but she kept her face impassive. Richard had always been a master at playing the long game, at keeping his cards close to his chest. And now, even in the face of death, he was still holding something back. Laura sat in her office, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the evening sky had turned an inky blue, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She hadn't been able to sleep since the cafe meeting with Richard. His words echoed in her mind, each revelation sinking deeper into her chest. Terminal illness. No inheritance. No warning. And that smile. That damned smile of his, like he was in control of everything, even now. Laura's instincts, honed over years of medical training and intuition, screamed at her that something wasn't right. She knew Richard too well. He didn't act without reason, and the entire situation felt too calculated. Too convenient. If he was dying, why wasn't he scared? And why cut her out entirely after all their years together? She couldn't leave it alone. The questions gnawed at her until she found herself sitting in front of her laptop, digging deeper into his life, a life she thought she knew well. But as she scrolled through financial records, bank statements, and real estate holdings she hadn't known existed, her heart sank. Richard had been hiding things. Things that went far beyond their troubled marriage. One name kept appearing in transactions, *Megan Sawyer, star. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers over time. Laura leaned in closer, her eyes scanning every detail. The payments were regular, almost like support, but for what? She had never heard of this woman before, and Richard had never mentioned her. But the more she looked, the more she realized these weren't just financial slips. This was deliberate. She pulled up Megan Sawyer's information. A quick search led her to a modest apartment building in the heart of the city. It didn't match the lifestyle Richard was accustomed to, and it didn't seem like the sort of place he'd frequent. So why was he sending her money? Laura's breath quickened as the pieces started to fall into place. She knew what she had to do. She grabbed her keys, ignoring the clock as it ticked past midnight, and left her apartment. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear the fog of suspicion clouding her thoughts. She drove in silence, her mind racing with the possibilities. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The building where Megan lived was unremarkable, its brick facade worn and faded, but Laura's heart pounded as she approached the door. She stood there for a moment, hesitating, before pressing the buzzer next to Megan's name. There was a long pause, then a faint, shaky voice came through the intercom. Yes. Laura swallowed hard, steadying herself. I'm here to talk about Richard. Richard Hartman. Another pause. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door buzzed, and Laura stepped inside. The apartment was dimly lit, and Megan stood by the door, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. She was younger than Laura had expected, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair that hung limply around her pale face. Her eyes were red and swollen, like she'd been crying for hours. "Are you his wife?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Laura replied, her heart beating so loudly she could hardly hear herself speak. She hadn't expected the rush of emotion that came with those words. "I am his wife." But for how much longer? Megan stepped back, letting Laura into the small apartment. It was modest, sparsely furnished, and it didn't take long for Laura to notice the signs. A small crib in the corner, baby clothes folded neatly on a chair. Laura's breath caught in her throat. No. No, it can't be, star. Megan turned to her, eyes full of apology, regret, and something else, something vulnerable. "I didn't know about you at first," she said softly. He told me you two were over. That the marriage was done, that you were leaving him." Laura stood frozen, her gaze flicking between Megan and the crib, trying to process what she was hearing. "How long?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How long have you been involved with him?" Megan's eyes welled up with tears. 2 years. We met 2 years ago. I didn't know. I didn't know he was still with you." Laura's stomach churned. 2 years. Richard had been living a lie for 2 whole years, while she had been going through the motions of their marriage, wondering when it had all gone wrong. All the fights, the coldness, the distance, it all made sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" Laura's voice cracked as she tried to maintain her composure. "Why now?" Megan wiped her eyes, sniffling. "Because I'm pregnant," she said, her voice shaking. "And Richard, he's been different lately. Distant. I thought he was just scared about the baby, but now I think there's more to it. He hasn't been the same since he found out he was sick." Laura's mind spun. Sick. That was the excuse he'd given her, too. But now, everything felt like a twisted game. A man playing both sides, manipulating everyone in his orbit. "You said he hasn't been the same," Laura pressed, her voice tense. "What do you mean?" Megan sat down on the edge of the couch, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly. "He's been talking about getting everything in order, making sure the baby is taken care of. He's been obsessed with it. But the other day, I found him talking to a lawyer about a trust fund. He didn't mention it to me. And when I asked him, he just got angry. He told me I didn't need to worry about it." Laura's hands trembled. A trust fund. So Richard wasn't just planning for his death, he was setting something in motion, something big. The will, the illness, the financial secrecy. It wasn't just about ending their marriage. He was manipulating everything, controlling every outcome. "You need to leave him," Laura said, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside her. "He's using you, just like he's been using me." Megan's eyes filled with fear, but there was a flicker of understanding in them. She nodded, biting her lip. "I know," she whispered. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do this alone." Laura's heart clenched. Despite her own rage, her own betrayal, she saw the fear in Megan, the fear of being trapped, of being controlled. And for a moment, she remembered herself, younger and full of hope, believing in a man who had now turned both their lives into a nightmare. "You won't be alone," Laura said, her voice softer now, but steady. "We'll figure it out. Together." Laura sat in her car outside the house she once called home, her fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. The silence inside the car was deafening, but outside, the world continued as if her life hadn't just been torn open. The streetlights flickered in the dark, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Her mind raced with everything Megan had told her, the affair, the baby, the lies Richard had woven so effortlessly into their lives. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, staring at the house that now felt like a stranger's. But she knew she had to confront him. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The betrayal ran too deep to let it simmer in silence. Laura took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool night. Each step toward the front door felt heavy, like she was walking into a battlefield. In a way, she was. When she finally unlocked the door and stepped inside, the house was quiet, but a light was on in Richard's study. Of course. Always in control. Always 2 steps ahead. She made her way to the study, her heart pounding in her chest. She paused at the door, taking a moment to steady herself before pushing it open. Richard looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes before his expression settled into something neutral. "You're late," he said, his voice casual, as if they hadn't just had their world upended days ago. "I thought we weren't going to talk again until tomorrow." Laura stared at him, the words she had rehearsed in her mind suddenly scattered. She clenched her fists, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. "We need to talk now." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained seated, leaning back in his chair. "About what?" "About Megan." Laura's voice was steady, but she felt the anger bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to break through. She wasn't sure what she expected, a denial, some feeble attempt to lie his way out of it, but she needed answers. Richard didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I see," he said, his voice oddly calm. "So, you know." Laura felt a chill crawl up her spine. His nonchalance was infuriating. "You're not even going to deny it?" she asked, her voice rising. Richard stood up from the desk, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. "There's no point in lying anymore." Laura's heart twisted painfully in her chest. The confirmation hit harder than she thought it would, even though she had already known the truth. She took a step closer to him, her fists clenched at her sides. "You had an affair, Richard. For 2 years. And now, she's pregnant with your child." He looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening, before he met her gaze again. "Yes, I did. And yes, she's pregnant." Laura shook her head, disbelief coursing through her. "How could you? How could you do this to me? To us?" Her voice cracked, the hurt spilling out with every word. Richard sighed again, but this time, there was something heavier in his tone. "It wasn't about you, Laura. It wasn't something I planned." "That's supposed to make it better?" she shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "You lied to me for 2 years. You made me feel like I was the problem, like our marriage was falling apart because of me. All while you were—" She stopped, her words choking in her throat. "With her." Richard stepped forward, his expression softening in a way that felt entirely wrong in the moment. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't plan for this to happen." "Then why?" Laura demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "Why did you do it?" Richard hesitated, his eyes searching hers for something she wasn't sure she could give. "I was scared," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "When I found out about my diagnosis, I felt like everything was slipping away. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to face the fact that I was losing control of everything. Laura stared at him, her heart pounding in her ears. So, you thought sleeping with someone else was the answer? Starting a whole other life? Richard's shoulders slumped, the weight of his confession seeming to press down on him. It wasn't about her, Laura. It was about me. About how terrified I was of dying, of losing everything. She was a distraction. A way to feel alive when I felt like everything else was falling apart. Laura felt her chest tighten, anger and sadness warring inside her. That doesn't make it right. You didn't just betray me, Richard. You built a whole other life behind my back. A life I wasn't a part of. I know, Richard said quietly, his voice thick with something that almost sounded like regret. And I'm sorry. But the apology felt hollow, like an afterthought. Laura shook her head, the sting of betrayal still raw. Sorry doesn't fix this. You've shattered everything we built. Richard stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch her, but Laura stepped back, her body tense. I know I hurt you, he said, his voice soft, pleading. But I was scared. I didn't want to die alone. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. He was scared. She could understand that. She had dealt with patients who faced their mortality, patients who did desperate things when the fear of death consumed them. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. Not this time. Laura crossed her arms, her voice shaking with the weight of her pain. You don't get to use your illness as an excuse for what you've done. You don't get to manipulate me into feeling guilty for leaving you. I'm not trying to manipulate you, Richard insisted, his voice rising slightly in frustration. I didn't know how to face everything. I didn't want to lose everything all at once. You. My life. My control. Control. It always came back to that with him. Laura felt a bitter laugh bubble up in her throat, but she swallowed it down, her gaze hard. You've already lost me, Richard. You lost me the moment you decided to betray everything we had. Richard's face fell, and for a moment, she saw the man she had once loved, the man who had held her hand through difficult times, the man who had made her laugh when everything felt too heavy. But that man was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. I don't know what to do, Richard admitted quietly. I don't know how to fix this. Laura's heart twisted painfully. She didn't know how to fix it either. And maybe there wasn't a way to. Not anymore. You can't, she said softly. You've already broken it. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. And Laura realized that there might be no way forward. Not for them. Not after this. Laura wasn't sure why she agreed to meet Richard again. After their confrontation, after the lies, the betrayal, the hollow apologies, part of her wanted to walk away and never see him again. Yet, here she was, sitting across from him in the hospital cafeteria. His skin was pale, his cheeks hollow, and there was a fragility in him now that hadn't been there before. Despite everything, despite her anger, there was still a small part of her that couldn't shake the years they had shared. It wasn't pity, it was something more complicated, tangled up in history and habit. The conversation between them had been stilted, heavy with unspoken things. Richard had tried, in his way, to talk about anything but the inevitable. But as he sipped his coffee, his hand suddenly slipped, and the cup clattered to the floor, shattering. His body swayed in the chair, his face drained of color. For a split second, Laura froze, but then her instincts as a doctor took over. Richard, she called, her voice rising as she rushed to his side. His eyes were glazed, his breathing shallow. And then, in the next heartbeat, he collapsed to the floor. "Help!" Laura screamed, her voice cutting through the cafeteria's quiet hum. Several nurses rushed over as she knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "He needs immediate attention." Within minutes, Richard was being wheeled away, his condition critical. Laura watched as the doctors whisked him into surgery, leaving her standing alone in the sterile hallway, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. The sight of him, so vulnerable and helpless, rattled something inside her. But along with the concern came something else, a lingering sense of mistrust. Richard had controlled everything, every aspect of their lives, even when it seemed like he wasn't. The thought of that control tightening its grip even now, as he lay fighting for his life, gnawed at her. She found herself drifting, almost unconsciously, back to his office. The hospital bag she had grabbed when he collapsed still hung over her shoulder, and with it, the stack of documents she hadn't yet looked through. The will was buried there, folded between sterile legal papers, waiting like a secret she didn't want to unravel. But she had to know. Laura needed answers, not from Richard, but from whatever he had hidden in those carefully worded pages. Sitting at his desk, Laura opened the will and began reading. At first, it seemed like a standard document. A few legal phrases about his estate, a list of assets. The kind of clinical wording that didn't betray anything personal. But then, buried in the middle, her eyes caught a section that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about her. The will stated that after Richard's death, Laura would be legally responsible for Megan and the child. The terms were clear: she would manage the trust set up for them, ensuring their financial stability. And more than that, she would have custody over decisions regarding the child's welfare. It was as if Richard had written Laura into a role she had never agreed to, as though he had bound her, irrevocably, to this other life he had built in the shadows. Laura's hands trembled as she read further. The legal phrasing was intricate, designed to trap her in obligations she hadn't known existed. It was all there in black and white. Richard had crafted this will, not just to leave her out of his fortune, but to anchor her to Megan, to the child, to the mess he had created. He was dying, but somehow, he was still controlling her, tying her future to his indiscretions. A surge of anger rose in her, hot and fierce. How dare he? How dare he manipulate her again, even as he faced death? She had spent years being twisted by his needs, his fears, his desire for control. Now, with his health failing, he was reaching beyond the grave to dictate what her life would become. Laura stood abruptly, the papers slipping from her fingers and scattering across the desk. She couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. It wasn't just the betrayal of the affair, or even the lies. It was the realization that Richard never really saw her as a person. To him, she had been a means to an end, a tool in his carefully constructed life. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of the maelstrom of her thoughts. It was a text from the hospital. Richard was out of surgery, stable for now. The relief was fleeting, overshadowed by the storm raging in her chest. Laura couldn't stay in the office any longer. She grabbed her things and left, her mind racing as she walked through the hospital corridors. She had to see him. She needed to confront him one last time. He had to know she wasn't going to be a part of his twisted plan. When she arrived at his room, Richard was propped up in bed, pale but conscious. His eyes flickered open when she entered, a weak smile forming on his lips. "You came back," he said, his voice hoarse. Laura stood at the foot of the bed, her expression hard. "I read the will." Richard's smile faded. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding hers. I had to make sure they were taken care of, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This wasn't about them, Laura snapped. This was about you. You're trying to control everything, even after you're gone. You've trapped me, Richard. You've trapped me in a life I never wanted. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, his face creased with exhaustion. I was scared, he murmured. I didn't want to leave everything in chaos. I thought you'd understand. You always understood me. Laura felt the sting of those words. I don't understand this. You didn't ask me, you didn't even give me a choice. You've taken everything, Richard, and now you're asking me to take care of the child you had with another woman? To manage your mistakes? His eyes opened slowly, filled with a kind of regret that came too late. I didn't mean for it to be this way. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing for who? Laura shot back, her voice cracking. For you? For Megan? What about me? When did I stop mattering? Richard didn't have an answer for that. His gaze fell, and for a long moment, the room was silent. Laura stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on her. This man, the man she had once loved, had orchestrated her life, even in his final moments. She wasn't sure if she could forgive him. She wasn't sure if she could ever free herself from the binds he had woven so carefully around her. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beep of the heart monitor and the occasional shuffling of nurses outside the door. Richard was asleep, his face relaxed for the first time in days. The surgery had gone well, the doctors optimistic, but it hadn't lifted the cloud hanging over Laura. She stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, her thoughts racing. The weight of Richard's will, the cold calculation behind it, pressed down on her chest. She had been a pawn in his game, not just now, but for years. The betrayal had layers, each one sharper than the last. She had thought the lies were behind her after discovering his affair, but the will had shown her just how deep Richard's manipulations ran. He was still trying to control her from his hospital bed, his life slipping away, but his grip tightening. Laura knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay tangled in this web any longer. Megan and the baby, **** baby, were Richard's responsibility, not hers. She had spent enough years cleaning up after his messes, enough time being the reliable one. It was time to walk away. But just as she resolved to leave, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, surprised to see Megan's name. Hesitant, Laura answered. Laura, Megan's voice was trembling, her breath coming in quick gasps. I need to talk to you. It's about Richard. It's important. Laura frowned, stepping away from the window. What is it? Is something wrong? There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching uncomfortably. When Megan finally spoke, her voice was shaky but urgent. He's not sick. Laura, he's not dying. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Laura froze, her heart hammering in her chest. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. I saw the diagnosis. The doctors. He faked it, Megan cut in, her voice cracking. All of it. He's been lying to you, to everyone. He isn't dying, Laura. He was never terminal. The world seemed to tilt beneath Laura's feet, the room spinning as she tried to process what Megan was saying. Not dying, but how could that be? She had seen the fear in Richard's eyes, heard the doctors talk about his prognosis. He had played the part so convincingly, right down to the frail look in his eyes, the tremble in his voice when he talked about making peace with the end. How do you know this? Laura's voice was sharp now, cutting through Megan's hesitation. I helped him, Megan admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He told me he needed a way to keep you from leaving. That he was scared you'd abandon him, and that he had to do something drastic. At first, I thought he was just desperate, and I believed him when he said it would all work out. But now, I don't know. He lied to both of us, Laura. And I'm so sorry. Laura's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind spinning as the betrayal settled in. She felt like she was drowning in it. Megan had been part of Richard's plan, another piece of his twisted puzzle. The terminal illness, the will, it had all been a lie, a sick manipulation to trap her, to make her stay out of guilt and obligation. You knew, Laura said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. You knew he was faking, and you didn't tell me? I didn't realize how far it would go, Megan pleaded, her voice thick with guilt. I thought he just needed time to fix things, to convince you to stay. But now I see it for what it is. He's controlling both of us, and I can't be part of it anymore. I should have told you sooner. Laura's stomach twisted, her hands shaking as she tried to grasp the full weight of Megan's confession. Richard wasn't dying. He had orchestrated everything, the illness, the will, Megan's complicity, all to bind her to him even as their marriage crumbled. The love she had once felt for him, already withered, now turned to ash. How could you do this? Laura asked, her voice thick with disbelief. How could you stand by and let him manipulate me like this? I was scared, Megan whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. I thought he'd change, that once the baby was born, he'd stop all of this. But he hasn't. He won't. I'm sorry, Laura. Laura wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, to find Richard and demand answers. But the truth was, she already knew the answers. Richard had always been like this, controlling, calculating, willing to manipulate anyone to get what he wanted. She had just never wanted to see it. You need to leave him, Laura said, her voice hollow, emotionless. You need to take your child and get away from him. Because he won't stop. He'll keep twisting everything until there's nothing left. Megan's breath hitched on the other end of the line. I know. I will. I'm sorry, Laura. For everything. The line went dead, leaving Laura standing alone in the quiet room, her phone still clutched in her hand. She felt like the ground had shifted beneath her, the foundation of her life cracking wide open. Richard wasn't dying. Everything he had said, everything he had done over the last few months, had been part of an elaborate ruse to control her, to keep her trapped in his life. A deep, suffocating anger welled up inside her. She had spent years cleaning up after Richard's lies, forgiving him, rationalizing his behavior. But this was the final straw. He had manipulated her in the worst possible way, using her compassion, her sense of duty, against her. He had turned her love into a weapon. Laura dropped into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly weak. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Her marriage had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. Every decision, every argument, every tender moment, it had all been part of Richard's master plan to control her. And now, she had to make a choice. She could stay, continue to play the role Richard had written for her, or she could break free. She could leave, walk away from the wreckage he had created, and rebuild her life on her own terms. Laura lifted her head, her eyes dry but burning with resolve. She wouldn't be Richard's pawn any longer. He had taken enough from her, her trust, her love, her sense of self. But he wouldn't take her future. She stood, her hand steady now as she gathered her things. She didn't need Richard's permission, or his lies, to move forward. She was done being manipulated. Done being trapped. Laura stood in the doorway of Richard's hospital room, her eyes scanning the familiar lines of his face. He looked smaller now, diminished somehow, as though the weight of his lies had taken more from him than the illness he'd fabricated. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, there was something in them, fear, regret, maybe even hope. But she was too tired to decipher it. He didn't look like the man who had shattered her life, but then again, that was Richard's greatest trick. He had always seemed so composed, so rational. The man who could justify anything, spin any situation to his advantage. He'd spun them all, hadn't he? Megan, the baby, even his own wife. And now, here they were, at the edge of everything, with nothing left to salvage. "You came," Richard said softly, his voice strained. He tried to sit up, wincing as he moved, but Laura remained by the door, her hands gripping the strap of her purse as if it were an anchor. "I came because I need to end this," Laura replied, her tone sharper than she intended. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her again, but some part of her needed closure. Needed to see him admit what he'd done. Richard's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He shifted again, struggling to sit up straighter, and motioned to the chair by his bed. "Please. Sit. Let's talk." Laura hesitated for a moment, but then, with a resigned sigh, she crossed the room and sat. There was no point in dragging this out, no point in giving him another chance to twist things. She would hear him out, then walk away for good. "I know I've hurt you," Richard began, his voice low, trembling with an emotion she hadn't heard from him in years. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted it to go this far." Laura felt the anger rise in her chest, burning hot and sharp. "You never meant for it to go this far? Richard, you lied to me. You made me think you were dying. You manipulated everyone around you, including Megan. How far were you willing to go?" He winced at her words, but didn't turn away. "I was desperate, Laura. I didn't know what else to do. When I realized I was losing you, when I realized you were ready to leave me, I panicked. I thought if I could just make you stay, even for a little while longer, I could fix things. I could make us right again." "By faking a terminal illness?" Laura's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's not love, Richard. That's control." "I know," he whispered, the words broken, hollow. "I know. But I was afraid. I was so afraid of losing you, of losing everything. I thought if I could just get you to stay, we could figure it out." Laura's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his confession hanging between them. She wanted to feel sorry for him, wanted to believe that some part of this mess was driven by love. But the truth was, love hadn't driven Richard in years. Fear had. Fear of losing control, fear of being abandoned. And that fear had poisoned everything it touched. "I loved you," Laura said quietly, her voice shaking. "I loved you so much. But you destroyed that, Richard. You didn't give me a choice. You took away my agency, my trust. You turned me into a pawn in your game." Richard looked at her, his eyes brimming with something close to desperation. "I never stopped loving you, Laura. Everything I did, it was because I loved you." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't do this to someone you love. You don't lie, manipulate, and trap them. That's not love. That's control." And I can't be controlled anymore. He reached out, his hand trembling, but she didn't move. Please, Laura. Don't leave me. I need you. I'm lost without you. Those words, the ones she had once longed to hear, the ones that would have soothed all the pain years ago, now felt like poison. He needed her, but not in the way that people in love need each other. He needed her like an anchor, something to keep him steady, to keep him in control. You don't need me, Richard, Laura said softly. You need someone you can manipulate. Someone you can mold to fit your life. But that's not who I am anymore. Richard's face crumpled, and for a moment, Laura saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once made her feel cherished. But that man was long gone, buried beneath years of lies and deceit. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I know you are, she said, her voice steady now. But I can't stay. Not anymore. The door creaked open then, and Laura turned to see Megan standing in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She stepped inside hesitantly, her gaze flicking between Laura and Richard. I'm leaving, Megan said quietly, her voice trembling. I can't do this anymore. I thought you loved me, Richard. But now I see you were using me, too. You used me just like you used Laura. Richard's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. Megan, please. No, Megan shook her head, her voice stronger now. I'm done. I'm taking the baby, and we're leaving. Laura watched as Megan turned and walked out of the room, her shoulders squared despite the weight of what she was carrying. For the first time in a long time, Laura felt a surge of respect for the woman she had once viewed as her rival. Richard turned back to Laura, his face ashen. Please. Don't leave me, too. Laura stood, her movements slow but deliberate. She felt calm now, steady, as though the storm inside her had finally settled. She met his eyes one last time, searching for any trace of the man she had once loved. But there was nothing left. I have to, she said softly. I'm choosing myself this time. With that, Laura turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy but resolute. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for certain, she was free. As the door closed behind her, she didn't look back.